Hi everybody, this is a look at the Asahi Pentax Spotmatic F, and the Spotmatic range actually was produced from 1964 to 1976, and this F version came out in 1973, and the bodies are virtually the same on the different variants, but this model introduced full open aperture metering. The early versions worked in stop-down metering, so obviously that was a big advantage of this model. Now I'm going to run through its features and its controls, and hopefully tell you something a bit about it. So the Spotmatics, they were the first camera to come out with through the lens metering, and it was first announced at a 1960 photo show, and at that time Pentax were intending to make it a spot metered camera, but apparently when it got to production in 1964 they decided that it would be too difficult to produce the spot metered version, so they made it average metering. But unfortunately at that time they'd already produced the bodies with the name on, so it stuck to the Spotmatic name for spot metering. So first of all, with this camera, basically it's a manual exposure camera. In other words, you make the settings on the aperture and the shutter speed dial, and the battery only operates the meter. Does have a through the lens meter, but everything else is mechanical on it, which makes it a very reliable camera, and it feels really nice weight. Controls are nicely laid out, and it's a very nice camera to handle. So I'll start with the battery. Now the original batteries it used to take were mercury batteries, PX625s, which was this shape, but obviously you can't get mercury batteries anymore, and the voltage was 1.35 volt. Now what I do is, because I've got quite a few cameras that use similar batteries, it's worthwhile me doing this because they are quite expensive unfortunately. You can buy these adapters. It's like a shell, which is the PX625 shape, but what you can do is buy ordinary LR, or I recommend SR because it's silver oxide, SR44 batteries, these little button cells, and these fit inside this shell, and what it does is it's got a built-in circuit that reduces the 1.5 volt voltage down to the 1.35 voltage which this camera requires to give you accurate meter readings. So that's something I would recommend if you're thinking of doing a lot of photography with cameras that use this type of battery. It's worth getting one or two of these. The battery fits in the bottom. It's a battery cover. Just remove that now. I don't know why, but these particular covers seem to cross thread very easily. Now you put the battery in the plus side facing towards you, and it does show you that on the battery cover. Try and put this back on. I say they're very prone to cross threading very easily. So you can get it on. Now there is a battery check feature, and what you do is you set the shutter dial to B. So if you look on the top plate, this is the shutter speed dial, and after you've fitted the battery you can check it, or you can check it at any time of course. And what you should do is set the shutter speed dial to B just by rotating it, set it to the B setting, which is highlighted in green, and then it says set the ASA speed, which is done also around the shutter speed dial, set that to 100, and what it says is, if you look through the viewfinder, there's a needle on the right hand side, and that's what does the exposure reading. And as long as the needle is at the centre or above and doesn't flicker, then the batteries are okay. So that's the battery check for you. So anyway, once you've got the battery fitted and you want to fit film, to fit film you lift up the rewind crank, which is on this side on the top plate, and you just basically lift it up with your thumb and forefinger and pull it up, and it flicks the back open. That's where the film fits. Put the cartridge in that side, pull the leader over and insert it. There's two slots on the take-up spool. So insert it into one of them and just wind it on a little to start it off, so it'll catch on these little sprockets, and fire a nice shot off. And then you can put down the rewind crank and shut the back. And then you should take up any slack as well on the rewind crank. But it just says also you can set a film reminder, tell you what film you've got fitted. There's two settings here. One is for the film type. If you look here, there's a symbol that is for colour film. If you move this silver ring underneath the rewind crank, you can set it to tungsten lighting, or colour daylight film, or black and white film. So it's just basically a reminder what film you got fitted. And also on the bottom side here you've got a reminder of how many exposures you've got. That's on 36, but you can rotate that bottom dial to show 20, because film just be in rolls of 20 then, or 36 rather than 24 and 36. So it's just basically a reminder. And the same, once you fitted the film, you would lift up the rewind crank lever and rotate it in the direction of the arrow to take up any slack until it goes tense. So looking at the controls, you've got on the right hand side the advance lever. Inside the advance lever is a frame counter which starts off 2 frames below the 0, because obviously it requires that best to wind it on and lose a couple of frames because you've exposed that film to light when you fitted it. Then you can start at 0, and the next one would be your first photo. So that's the frame counter, which automatically resets when you open the back. The advance lever, it's got a very nice feel to it actually. It rotates 160 degrees, and you can do it in short strokes rather than just one long stroke. And another nice feature of this camera is, you know when the shutter is cocked, because if you look, there is a little window just between the shutter firing button and the advance lever, and that is orange at the moment, which shows that the shutter is cocked. And when you fire the shutter by this button here, you'll see that changes to a black window. So you can look at that and tell if your shutter is cocked or not. So you've got the shutter release button, and that is threaded, so you could use it on a tripod with a threaded remote cable. Around that is a lock button, so if you move that to the left, it stops you firing the shutter accidentally, or even pressing it down at all, even when it's not cocked. So here's the shutter speed dial, and that goes from B for bulb, which basically you hold down the shutter release button and it holds the shutter open until you let go. And it's got then settings of between 1 second all the way up to 1/1000th of a second. And a nice feature of this dial, which I like, is it actually keeps rotating. You don't have to go back and start all over again. You can go from 1/1000th of a second right to B. The ASA speed, as I mentioned before, is around the inside of this dial, and what you do is you lift up the outer ring and then you can rotate that, and let's say I usually use 400 ASA speed setting, so that's set to that. And another feature is you do have a time setting option which works quite unusually on this camera. Basically what you do is you would have it on bulb, you would cock the shutter, and then when you actually fire the shutter, keep holding it down, and then if you move the lock button across, like so, it actually keeps the shutter open, so you could time it with a watch, so you can have a long time exposure for nighttime shots, etc. And then when you want to release the shutter again, you just move it back to the right hand side and it closes the shutter. I can only see the problem with that being that obviously doing all that would move the camera slightly. So going across on the top panel, you've got a hot shoe, which is actually a hot shoe. The first ones didn't have a hot shoe, they just had a shoe to mount a flash. This is actually a hot shoe that can sync with a electronic flash, and it's showing you a big X there, because basically what you would do is you would set the shutter speed dial to the X setting, which it shows you next to the 60ths of a second. Going over to the left, you've got the name and serial number. I think this is quite a late one actually, that number. I've already showed you the rewind, crank and the film reminder settings. Going to the back of the camera, there's very little there at all. Basically you've got the Asahi name, you've got the viewfinder of course. Underneath you've got a battery cover, which I've shown you fit the battery. You've got a tripod socket, and this is the release button, which obviously when you get to the end of the film, you just press that in once, and then you can lift up the rewind lever. I forget which way it is, that way, and rewind the film back into the cartridge. It also serves a different feature actually, which is doing multiple exposures, which is quite a quirky thing on this, a bit unusual. What it says in the manual you can do is, first of all, after you've took your first shot, just lift up, rewind, crank, take up any slack on the film, put the lever back down, and then it says to hold on to the rewind crank, and while you're doing that, just press the rewind button in, and while still holding the rewind crank, then advance the film, and apparently then it doesn't wind on the film, it just cocks the shutter, so you could do a multiple exposure. And it does recommend as well, after you've done that, just take a blank shot to make sure you don't get any frames that overlap. Looking at the front of the camera, you've got the names. It's a nice looking camera, by the way. This is I like the black one. You can buy a chrome one as well. You've got a self timer here, which can be set actually anywhere from around 6 up to 12 seconds, and you need to move that at least 90 degrees, and then when you fire the shutter you do it by this button, and that sets the self timer off. And I say that should be approximately about 6 seconds, but if you go all the way around it's about 12 seconds. On this side you've got two flash sync sockets. This X one is for electronic flash, so if you fit electronic flash that hasn't actually got a contact which sits on the shoe, you connect to the sync socket on the flash to this socket here and it will sync that way. This other socket that says FP is for flash bulbs, so if you're using flash bulbs you put the sync socket into there, and then you need to set the correct shutter speed depending on the flash bulb type, and it tells you those in the manual. Here is a stop down lever. Now on the original Spotmatics, that is the way you would actually meter, because you would have the lens fitted, you would compose and focus your subject with the lever down, which would be at full aperture, because obviously then the viewfinder is brighter. But then when you want to take the exposure reading, you push this lever up, which stops down the lens to the working aperture, what you've got set on the lens, and then you would set the meter, look at the meter and set your shutter speed and aperture accordingly to get the needle in the viewfinder in the centre, which is deemed to be the correct exposure. Now the exposure reading is taken from the whole frame. It's averaged out of the whole frame, so obviously you've got to take that into consideration and may need to compensate accordingly. The viewfinder coverage, by the way, is 93% with a I think it's a 0.89 magnification. So that's the way you would use it on the early Spotmatics with the stop down lever, but on this one basically all that does is give you a depth of field preview, because the F version works in full open aperture reading. So basically what you do is, as soon as you remove the lens cover on this one, the meter becomes active. Anything above EV2 the meter is active, and I think it's got a range of about EV2 to EV18, and so the meter's reading all the time now, and you could use that lever if you want to give you a depth of field preview, but you should do the actual exposure reading at full aperture. So looking at the lens, this is a 50mm 1.4, and you've got the aperture setting around this ring on the lens. Now it goes in half stops, except for the first one from 1.4 to 2, and the last one from 11 to 16 are in full stops, but in between those everything is in half click stops, which is handy when you've got a manual exposure camera like this, obviously, but there's nothing stopping you stopping halfway in between a stop anyway. It will close the aperture down to that setting. You've got your focusing on this lens, it goes from infinity down to 0.45 meters. And the thing I like about this camera as well is, as you know, I've got a lot of Nikon cameras, and this is one of the few that has the focusing, the aperture, same as you would do on a Nikon. So obviously it just feels nice in the hand, and I know where the controls are and everything. So anything else I need to tell you about this? Have a look at my notes. The lenses, to use the full aperture metering on this Spotmatic F, you need the SMC lenses, which are super multi-coated Takumar lenses, which have a lever on the lens. I'll show you that. To remove the lens, it's a screw type, an M42 screw mount, which was first introduced by Leica, I believe, and then used by Praktica and some other manufacturers. So to take the lens off, you just basically hold it and unscrew it, and the lens comes off. And if you look inside the lens mount, you've got a feature here on the camera that can read the aperture setting of the lens. That's how it does the metering in the stop down. You've got your mirror. There's no lockup feature on the mirror on this camera. The viewfinder as well, let me just mention, doesn't have a split screen. It has a, as you can see, a lighter middle area that's a Fresnel screen, which helps focusing, of course. This is one of the SMC lenses, and this is where the aperture control is for the lens. That couples with the camera body. And you've also got a switch here that sets it from auto, which is full auto aperture reader, into the stop down mode, but obviously on this camera, like I say, just leave it in that setting. What else I need to tell you? In America, there was imported by a company called Honeywell. So on the American imported cameras, the name will say Honeywell Pentax rather than Asahi. Put the lens on, you just screw it back on again, tighten it up. It only goes so far. After the Spotmatics, Pentax brought out the famous K mount. So this is the last ones to use the M42 mount. That's something to tell you. Exposure, etc. ISO ranges from 20 to 3200. And as I say, it's a very nice camera. And what I like about it, it's all manual exposure, so it's good for learning with. So there you go. I've got no other accessories or anything to show you on that except a case. So let's look at the Spotmatic F, and I hope you've enjoyed this video.